Hi everyone. In this video I would like to go over the suite of tools provided by SailingPerformance for performance analysis so that you can understand what each of the tools do. So let's start up with the Polar Manager. So this is, as a standalone application, is a program which lets you view polars. So let's go ahead and open a polar to see what we are talking about. Let's get a 36.7, the first 36.7 polar here, for instance. So in this program, you can't upload any sailing data. It's just a tool so that you can view the polar. You can also modify it graphically if you want. You can also import from different sources like a Adrena, Expedition, or other types. You can export, so that can be useful when you're working with the various programs. And you can also do funky stuff like overlay some other polars. Let's get a Deckman polar, for instance. There we go. So we're now overlaying two polars, so that can be quite interesting to see. Like for instance, if you're making you're improving a polar or doing things like that. So that's mostly a viewing and conversion and graphically updating, or you can also manually update some values here if you want to. So this is the Polar Manager. Next up is the crossover chart, which is also a viewer tool. So let's get this running. Crossover chart lets you view crossovers. So I've got one already made here. Let's have a look at it. So you can view, so here's a crossover. We have true wind angle at the bottom, in our case, true wind speed on the side. So this corner here corresponds to light wind and an upwind, and this corner here would be heavy air downwind. And then you can see all my shapes, and it's very easy here to create new shapes. So like if I want to add, let's say I'm adding a J4, I'm going to create a new sail element graphically, start drawing it around here. When I'm done, I click done, and here is my new J4, which I will add to my head sails. Okay, so this can also tool can also be used on board, and you can have while sailing. You can connect it to the instruments, and you will have a little cursor displaying where you're sailing, and that'll tell you quickly whether you're getting close to sail change or try to predict the next leg, things like that. There are quite a few things you can do with this tool. You can load a polar as well in here. So let's try this one, see what it looks like. And so now, as you can see, we've got some polar lines of apparent wind speed, you've got your targets, and you can also view your crossover in a polar format, and you can also view it in apparent. So that's the crossover chart. As a side, it's mostly used for sails, but we also have cases where people want to use crossovers for, say, ballast or stacking or anything that needs kind of a reference. So it can be quite a useful tool to use even on board as a target reference. Next up is the onboard assistant. Let's get it up and running. So this is the start of the onboard assistant. Onboard assistant is also a tool that is mostly used on board while sailing. And the purpose is to take notes on anything that will be of importance when you do your analysis, but that does not have a sensor, and that is not, so the information is not collected by the onboard electronics. So this is the startup page. I'm going to specify my sail list out of my sail inventory. Today's light wind, I'm not taking the J3. We'll take the A1 and the A2. I'm going to start the assistant, and I'm going to specify that I'm sailing in Valencia, and we're using the mast from 2022, and this is going to be a windward leeward racing. And I can now start, say the boat goes out of the harbor, we hoist the sail, and officially my day starts in terms of performance. And I can now start pinging sails up and say I now have the main and the J1. And there's all kinds of note taking we can take. The manual entry here, I've declared in the configuration that I want to be able to specify what my daggerboard percentage is, and maybe my ballast is currently full, and currently I am at the helm. Click OK. So all these, you can ping all kinds of different events, say balance, just when you got there's a good feel for the boat, something you want to look at in the evening, and we pinged a good event, a good balance event. So all these different types of events and things you can ping will end up in an XML file, which you should recover at the end of the day from your onboard PC. And this will be used with the race replay, which we're going to see in a minute. Next tool is quite an important one. It's called the log cleaner. And it's a bit of a Swiss knife that will help you do all kinds of operations to a data log. We have data logs coming in all shapes and forms. They can come from Expedition, from Adrena, directly from the electronics. It might be just a GPX file coming from your watch, or some kind of data logger with NMEA. This tool contains all the features you will need in order to convert any of this input into something that will be readable by race replay. So typically, the most typical, I guess, would be the universal log cleaner, where you will specify an input file. So let's go ahead and take maybe an expedition log. And then the wizard will take you through a bunch of pages that you have to validate and say, okay, well, in my expedition file, the timestamp is denoted by this UTC variable, which is a format UTC. And in this file, the latitude and longitude have the labels lat and long, and they're in degrees, dot degrees. Then you can go and say which variables would you like in the output. Maybe some of the variables are empty, so you actually don't need to specify them. And then you'll have to specify how many decimals and what type of number it is, and all those kind of things. And at the end, yeah, so it serves other purposes. So the normalizing, if we carry on, there's a place where you can filter some of the data. You can derive calculated variables. You can even add wind from a grid file if, for instance, you're cleaning a log that is coming from just, say, a dinghy or some boat that does not even have wind instruments. You can also specify a different output frequency, which means you can downsample this log, and it's a proper downsampling as it does averaging. So typically we would do this if a boat comes back from a long 1 week offshore and it's got a huge gigabyte size file with 1 second data. We can downsample that to maybe 10 seconds. You could adjust the time. If your log was typically an expedition log would be in UTC and you'd rather have everything in local time, you could do that here, and then you specify some what the output format should be, and then you just run your log cleaning, and then you get a post-processed log, which will then be usable in our next tool, which is the race replay. The race replay is kind of the central program in all the software suites, and a race replay will take an input, a log file, which should be most probably the output of the log cleaner. Then you do have to go through a configuration process through what we call the config file manager, where you will explain to race replay how your log is formatted, and you also specify a little bit like in the onboard assistant what sails can come up if you have some special manual entry variables such as a change of helmsman or the ballast, the dagger boards, and then optionally you might have an event file coming from the onboard assistant. So that may not be the case, you could uncheck that. But in our case, we do have that. You will need to specify a polar, and optionally, you can have a crossover chart, which will be useful in your analysis, because if you specify your target crossover, then the software will be able to point to you at times where maybe you were not sailing with the recommended sail from your crossover. So once we run this, it loads up all the data, and we get to the main window in a second. Here's our main window, and we have the basics is just this little tracker where we can move the boat around. We know when it's starting the racing. There's a race start line here, and then you see a whole bunch of events, At any time, you can add events here. Here, for example, I've got, or I could add maybe an annotation, and here we dipped out 2. And then once you're in here, you can start looking at calibration. Here's a tack. I can look at each tack, review tacks and jibes, and see, you know, what were your values of true in speed, true in direction before and after? Is there any calibration issue? Once you go through all these, you can start creating reports, and one of the main ones will be the calibration report. You can also create phases. So that's quite an important concept. So I'm just going to go quickly through that. There's other tutorials who will explain how to do that more in depth, but I'm creating phases, and phases will be places where the boat was sailing in a straight line, in a steady straight line. And once you have all these phases, then we can do all kinds of reports and graphs, such as the most typical, I guess, would be an upwind graph. VMG upwind, so here it is on port and starboard, what was the boat speed, the black line being the polar, any number of analysis you can do with Race Replay. It's quite a thorough program. You can look at maneuvers, look at straight line, look at statistics, graph anything versus anything, do all kinds of interesting reports, look at tactical stuff like your pre-start, all kinds of stuff. Once you are done, you can also, you have within the Race Replay, you've got the module, the Polar Manager and a crossover chart module. And so the difference between this module and the Polar Manager standalone that we saw is that all of a sudden, as you can see, if we zoom in, maybe I'll remove and let's look at the 12 knots. I've got a couple of dots here. Each dot corresponds to one of the phases that I just created. So now I'm able to update my polar using sailing data, and the same would be true for crossover chart. So that's quite a powerful tool. Although what we usually do is we would rarely update a polar from just one sailing session, which is the limit of this Race Replay. It's only displaying one sailing session. This sailing session might be quite long. It could be the whole week that you were offshore. Nevertheless, that's only one session. So for that reason, once you're done doing all your analysis on a specific session, you might have created a report for your crew on that session. You will then upload all the data to a database. And this will allow you to now start playing with the last tool called the Perf query. And the Perf query has most of the functionalities that you would find in Race Replay, except everything is based on the database. So here's the main interface. It's got an access database that we filled up with Race Replay. There's also a MySQL solution. We also need to specify a polar and a crossover chart, and then we go over and specify a query, and we'll say, well, I want to look at maybe all the entire data, or maybe limit it to some wind speeds or wind angles. In our case, we're just going to take the entire database. So if I click on count here, I can see that in my database I've got 283 phases in there coming from multiple days. So I can run a query, which will open a query window. And so this query window has the main tool in there will be this phase table from, as you can see, we've got different days. Here we're sitting on the 29th, here on the 28th, and it's got all the phases. Well, from this table, I can, first of all, do a lot of filtering because I only want to see specific things, but I can also create some of the same graphs that we had in Race Replay. For example, we can go and see this VMG graph again, upwind. All of a sudden, we're going to have way more data, and maybe I want to look at things by sail, and then I can create trend lines by sail. And now I can have a much more in-depth analysis of my crossover ranges. You know, you typically see that J1 is probably holding quite well above 13 knots when we thought of those J2. And then actually J2 and one reef is possibly a little bit better than the J1 with one reef. So we can do all kinds of stuff. There's all some reports as well with bin reports and all kinds of stuff we can do with that. where we can really extract a lot of interesting information from multiple sailing sessions. Once again, we have this polar manager here, and that is probably the main tool we would use to update a polar. Right, and the polar manager, I'm not sure why my points should be displaying. I've got some points here. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I've got the wrong polar updated. Here's all my data points here. For the demo purposes, I got the wrong polar, but I could start and updating my polar for these data points now. Right, so here is a brief introduction of all the different tools and what they are used for. So maybe now a quick word on the licensing level. We have a couple of different license levels here, as can be seen on our website. So we've got the standalone programs which you can buy separately, or we've got these 3 packs, the standalone, pro, and team. So the standalone is obviously very reasonably priced. It's also quite limited in what it can do. It doesn't come with a polar manager and crossover chart. It just has the race replay with quite limited features, onboard assistant, and a log cleaner. So you can do basic analysis. You have no access to database or any advanced features like that. Then we go to the Pro Pack. Now all of a sudden this Pro Pack does have the polar manager and the crossover charts in a standalone form, as well as there's the polar manager crossover chart features within Race Replay and Perf Query. And it also has access to database, so that's why we have the Perf Query in there. So it's already quite a good pack for your average to advanced sailor. The limitations will be that you're a bit limited on the variables that you can have. It's got all your basic performance variables such as boat speeds, true and angle, true and direction, VMG. It will have things like heel and trim, and it will have a variable for forestay tension, but it kind of stops there, and it says that anything above that will come in the team pack. So the team pack will have access to pretty much unlimited variables, such as any extra sensors like some load cells you might have. It's also got features so that you can create calculated variables if you want to average, do some smoothing on some of the variables. It has calculated variables such that you can transform maybe a pressure sensor into loads in tons or in pounds. It also has the possibility to incorporate data coming from other sources, such as if you have an advanced sail vision program with V-spars as such, you can see all that variable in there. It's got the possibility to plot data from multiple boats if you happen to collaborate with other teams, or scrap data from the web. You can actually view the data of other competitors, and you can do some analysis, some performance analysis over that. It also allows you to upload video and synchronize video and audio and images to the track, which means it makes it really powerful, makes Race Replay a very powerful debrief tool. And it's got also some pretty advanced calibration tools and the ability to compare 2 tacks and overlay the track of the 2 tacks and see what the differences were. So quite an advanced program. Most people can achieve what they want with the Pro Pack, sorry, but for sure any more professional team will need this team pack in order to be able to do all of the analysis that they want. Right, I hope this was useful and that you now have a better overview of all the different tools in the Sailing Performance suite of software.